You are in the middle of a conversation, and in less than 10 seconds, someone has rearranged the furniture of your mind. You no longer trust your memory, your feelings, or the timeline of what happened. And suddenly you find yourself apologizing for something you don't remember doing. That quick, quiet theft is the essence of control. It arrives not with chains or laws, but with a pattern of small, precise moves that hijack your attention and rewrite your inner weather. If you've ever felt dumbfounded by how easily someone could make you doubt yourself, that moment is the admission ticket into the psychology you need to understand. Control is not a single act. It's an architecture of influence built from repeated micro decisions, emotional nudges, and relational debts. When someone is trying to control you, they are not merely asking you to act in a particular way. They are reshaping the incentives inside your head so that the easier path is their preferred outcome. You'll meet two types of control: the blunt, obvious coercion you can see, and the surgical, almost invisible kind that rearranges your perception of what is reasonable, loving, or necessary. The reason you are vulnerable to these subtle operations has less to do with willpower and more to do with how your brain evolved to live in groups. Humans are social animals. Your neural hardware was optimized to predict and coordinate with others, which makes unpredictability dangerous and social harmony rewarding. That same machinery that kept your ancestors alive now betrays you when someone weaponizes your desire to belong, to be approved, or to avoid discomfort. Under the surface of any manipulative exchange, there is a neurochemical soundtrack. Cortisol spikes when you feel threatened. Adrenaline narrows your attention. And the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for careful reasoning, slows down. In those moments of biological reaction, you do not fail because you are weak. You fail because your brain is doing exactly what it's designed to do: protect you from immediate perceived threat by prioritizing speed over accuracy. Understanding that gives you a huge advantage because it reframes your reactions as data, not destiny. You can learn to read those physical reactions like signposts. The sudden heat in your face, the urge to explain, the tightening in your chest, these are not moral judgments about your character. They are signals that your internal thermostat is being nudged. If you begin to notice these sensations as they occur, you create a small, invaluable window between stimulus and response where control can shift away from the manipulator and back into your own hands. Manipulators are not wizards. They are pattern recognizers who learn to exploit predictable human reflexes. Their toolkit includes a range of moves: minimizing your concerns, twisting facts, timing requests to moments when you are tired or distracted, mixing praise with pressure, each designed to provoke an automatic response that serves them. The sophistication isn't always in their cruelty. Often it's in their economy. They need very little to change your behavior for a long time. Beneath those tactics is often a simple human story: scarcity. Someone who tries to control you usually feels scarce in a deeper way, scarce in love and status or in control over their own life. They try to manufacture predictability by compressing your options and increasing your dependence. Recognizing that their drive comes from lack doesn't make their tactics less damaging, but it does give you a psychological edge. When you see need instead of pure malice, you can respond strategically rather than spiraling into personal shame. Your personal history matters in ways you probably underestimate. Early attachment patterns, family scripts about obedience versus independence, and cultural messaging about politeness or respectability all tune you to be more or less receptive to different kinds of manipulation. It's not just about who you are now. It's about the narratives that were impressed on you when your brain was still wiring its default responses. Once you realize how much of your reactivity is learned, you stop treating it as an immutable truth and start treating it as a system you can update. A simple story will make this concrete. Imagine a mid-level manager who always says yes to the boss, then spends nights replaying meetings and rearranging his calendar to make sure he never disappoints. He convinces himself he's competent while his most valuable resource, his attention, is being auctioned off. The boss didn't shout or threaten. The boss positioned praise like a leash and used vague promises to keep options open. The manager's compliance looked like choice, but it was actually a sequence of default responses activated under social pressure. There's a crucial line between influence and control that most people blur. Influence is transparent and reciprocal. Both parties understand the trade. Control, by contrast, hides its ledger and capitalizes on your blind spots. If you can become fluent in recognizing the difference, you stop mistaking manipulation for normal relational negotiation, and you can call the phenomenon by its true name without guilt. You are literally trading something every time you concede. Not just a decision, but time, energy, and a little piece of your agency. Manipulators are masters of the slow transfer. They don't take much at first, but they set the mechanism so that each concession makes the next one easier. Those small debts compound until you owe far more than you intended. And because the exchange feels relational, compassion, forgiveness, duty, you forgive what you would never forgive in a transaction. Our cognitive biases grease the wheels of that compounding. Reciprocity makes you feel indebted when someone does something nice. Even if the gesture is a strategic chess move, the sunk cost fallacy keeps you invested because you've already given so much. Confirmation bias filters information, so you see the manipulator's narrative as validating rather than suspect. These are not moral failings, they're mental shortcuts that humans use to manage complexity, and manipulators design their moves to feed those shortcuts. One of the most effective tactics in their arsenal is the creation of urgency. Pressure to decide quickly collapses your ability to consult your values, gather perspective, or get outside input. It converts thought into instinct. When someone frames a choice as a scarce opportunity or a limited window, they are not simply making a sales pitch. They are trying to switch your brain's operating system from deliberation to habit. If you notice someone's pacing and how they prefer to make decisions in compression, you have already exposed one rung of their ladder. Flattery functions as a Trojan horse. When someone praises you, your defense is naturally lower. Praise triggers social reward pathways that make you more susceptible to requests. That doesn't mean every compliment is suspicious, but when praise is followed by a request that feels misaligned with your preferences, it's a useful signal to pause and calibrate. Your brain loves being liked. Manipulators know this and sometimes weaponize admiration to buy small concessions. Vagueness is another quiet tool. When a person is intentionally fuzzy about plans, expectations, or consequences, they maintain flexibility and keep you guessing. Ambiguity allows them to move the goalposts without contradiction and to later reinterpret your agreements as different from what you understood. If someone habitually answers questions with more questions, or offers ambiguous promises, treat that as information about their strategy rather than a personality quirk. You also exist inside collective dynamics that can amplify control. Authority and social proof make ordinary requests extremely powerful. Milgram's experiments and follow-up research show that when people perceive authority or consensus, they surrender responsibility. In everyday life, this looks like complying with a boss because everyone does it, or deferring to a family elder because of perceived tradition. Recognize the social scaffolding under these pressures, and you will understand why individual willpower often fails in the face of group dynamics. The impulse to retaliate against a manipulator is usually understandable yet counterproductive. When you respond with anger or escalation, you feed the very drama that empowers them. Reactivity hands them more emotional information to exploit and often confirms their narrative about you being volatile or unstable. The smarter move isn't suppressing your feelings, it's naming them, containing them, and choosing a response that aligns with your long-term strategy rather than immediate catharsis. This is where the biology becomes tactical. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that plans and evaluates, is slow and metabolically expensive. The limbic system is quick and hungry for resolution. Under stress, the limbic system takes the wheel and the prefrontal goes offline. Your job when faced with manipulation is to keep your thinking brain connected long enough to implement a counter strategy, because once your fight or flight instincts kick in, you've already lost leverage. You can train your inner thermostat to create that connection. Simple stoic practices, breathing deliberately for a count, pausing before you speak, asking a clarifying question, are not moral grandstanding. They are physiological hacks that restore executive function. Doing nothing dramatic, just delaying, shifts the conversation because most manipulators rely on your immediate reaction when you withhold it. Their script falters. Rehearse small delays in low-stakes moments so under real pressure those pauses feel like muscle memory. The act of naming your emotional state is a surprisingly powerful intervention. Neuroscience research shows that labeling an emotion, saying aloud, I feel manipulated, or I feel pressure, dampens the amygdala response and enhances prefrontal activity. It is not about labeling to shame yourself. It's a precise tool that turns chaotic feelings into data you can work with. When you name the feeling, you externalize it and regain ownership, which weakens the manipulator's foothold. Boundaries are not about building walls. They are about creating reliable contours for interaction. A boundary tells the other person what you will and will not do. And crucially, it communicates that your actions follow a rule rather than moment-to-moment whim. People who try to control you depend on unpredictability. When your responses become predictable in the sense of principled rather than pliable, their leverage shrinks because they can't bargain over your identity. Language shapes power dynamics in ways you rarely notice. Shifting from accusatory use statements into reflective statements reduces reactivity and increases clarity. Saying, I need more time to think about this, carries far more social weight than you can't rush me, because it frames the choice as a preference rooted in your internal standard rather than as a comment on their behavior. The subtle change reduces the theatricality of the exchange and keeps the moral high ground neutral. Your relationship to narratives matters. People trying to control you will often hand you a story in which you occupy a particular role, victim, betrayer, savior, or child, and then expect you to act consistent with that role. The philosophical idea that the map is not the territory becomes practical here. Their narrative is a map they want you to follow, not an objective truth. When you treat their story as one version among many, you regain the freedom to choose your own role. There are linguistic red flags that reveal manipulative intent if you start listening for them. Phrases that suggest ultimata cloaked as concern or conditional love disguised as advice are not always malicious, but are often functional. They try to set the terms of engagement without negotiation. Hearing those phrases should trigger a factual curiosity in you. What outcome is this person trying to secure, and how does this language serve them more than it serves a genuine shared interest? People often confuse being liked with being safe, and that confusion is fertile ground for control. Pleasing is an armor you learned because it worked at some point. Teachers, parents, bosses rewarded conformity, so you doubled down on it. But pleasing is a strategy with diminishing returns. The more you do it to avoid conflict, the less autonomous you become. Recognizing that pleasing can be learned and unlearned is liberating because it reframes flattering compliance as a skill you can choose to stop using. One of the most underrated tactics you can adopt is pre-commitment. Decide in advance what you will do in common situations where control attempts arise. Write your boundaries down, think through likely scenarios, and rehearse short phrases that embody your limits. When the moment comes, your mind doesn't need to invent courage. It only needs to retrieve a performed plan. This reduces the energy drain of decision making under pressure and makes you much less persuadable. There's also a paradoxical use of vulnerability that most people miss. When used intentionally, a small, transparent admission of your own limits or uncertainty can disarm manipulative strategies that rely on exploiting fear of abandonment or prestige. Showing that you are not invulnerable removes one lever they could use to embarrass or dominate you. Vulnerability does not mean giving up boundaries. It means being honest about where you stand so that negotiation can be clean instead of weaponized. Silence is a surprisingly aggressive tool for reclaiming power. Nobody likes a vacuum in a conversation. And manipulators often try to fill it with pressure. When you refuse to fill the silence, you force them to either state their request more plainly or reveal inconsistencies in their story. The discomfort of silence tends to wear on the manipulator faster than on you because their tactics depend on momentum. Your silence interrupts it and buys you information. Your self-concept is one of the most stabilizing defenses you can cultivate. If you have an internal narrative that affirms your worth independent of others' approval, then manipulative attempts to erode that worth will fail. Building a robust self-concept is not about narcissism. It's about having a clear set of values and criteria for how you will be treated. When you evaluate requests against those criteria rather than against the immediate emotional payoff, you are less likely to be steered. There is a cognitive pivot that, when applied, reframes the entire interaction. Instead of asking, how can I convince them? Start asking, what does their behavior make more true about their needs? And what does it make less true about my obligations? This small change in question moves you from a posture of reaction into one of analysis and moral clarity. It shifts your energy from trying to fix the other person to protecting your own horizon, and that shift is both subtle and decisive. Most people think outsmarting a manipulator means a confrontation, a brilliant rebuttal, or a dazzling rhetorical counterattack. In truth, the most effective moves are quieter, preventing predictability, owning your internal responses, honoring your lines, and using strategic silence. Those moves are slow, boring, and stubbornly practical, but they collapse manipulation by denying the manipulator the reflexive reactions they rely on. Once you understand the anatomy of their tactics and begin practicing small, principled responses, you stop being prey and start being an agent with predictable values. There is one deceptively simple 3-step sequence that will often dismantle a control attempt within minutes, and it looks almost too polite to be powerful. It uses curiosity instead of accusation, pre-commitment instead of improvisation, and calibrated silence instead of instant rebuttal. When you learn how to deploy that sequence in the specific language that works in high-stakes conversations, you will see manipulators lose their footing in ways that feel almost unfair. If you want to learn that exact sequence and how to practice it until it becomes reflex, continue, because that's where the real leverage starts. The sequence I'm about to teach you is less about clever lines and more about shifting responsibility back onto the person trying to control you. And it begins with a question that sounds disarmingly simple but functions like a scalpel asked to be told their plan. When you ask someone to explain their reasoning, you are doing two things at once. You force them to slow down, and you move the conversation into the domain of structure rather than emotion. That change of domain is the real power. Most controllers survive by keeping things emotional and ambiguous. The question you use matters because vague curiosity is easiest to co-opt. Make your curiosity diagnostic. Instead of why are you upset, try what outcome are you trying to achieve here. That tiny shift makes the other person convert feelings into operational steps. And manipulators are famously poor at articulating consistent, defensible plans. There's a social mechanism operating when they try to control you. People believe their own stories more easily than they believe others. If you make someone explain their logic aloud, you convert their intuition into testable statements. Once out loud, their inconsistencies become visible both to you and to them. Curiosity also functions as a behavioral mirror. People often hear themselves and adjust. Socratic questioning in therapy and philosophy is no accident. When you help someone map their argument, you frequently guide them away from coercion because they no longer have the emotional momentum they used to hide behind. But curiosity can be weaponized against you if you're not precise. Endless questions that drift into empathy without teeth allow the manipulator to regain control with florid stories. So anchor your curiosity with an explicit time frame or a specific metric. Ask for the precise end result they expect, not the drama. In practice, this looks like short, targeted prompts. What exactly do you want me to deliver? When do you need it by? Will happen if I say no. Those prompts reframe the exchange as a series of transactions with observable outcomes rather than a moral ledger you must constantly reconcile. Asking the right questions also serves as a thin psychological armor. It signals that you operate by criteria, not by feelings. People who try to control you prefer to recruit those who operate from obligation and guilt. When you shift to criteria, they must either meet those criteria or lose the leverage they were counting on. The second pillar of the sequence is pre-commitment, which is a formal psychological trick. You remove ambiguity by establishing rules for yourself before the manipulative pressure hits. This is not bravado. It's the same cognitive architecture that helps people stick to diets, workouts, or study schedules. There's a long lineage of thinkers who argued for self, binding as a virtue. Odysseus binding himself to the mast to avoid the sirens is a methodological shorthand for a practice you can use in ordinary life. Constrain your future options to protect your agency right now. Implementation intentions are the modern cognitive version of that method. When you make an if, then plan ahead of time. If X happens, then I will do Y. You reduce the mental load of crisis decisions under stress. Your default brain is lazy. Pre-commitment automates the choice you actually want to make. You can make pre-commitment social to increase its force. Tell a colleague, post a short policy in your email signature, or state your working hours publicly. When your boundary has witnesses, the manipulator's attempt to whittle it down becomes not just a conversation with you, but a negotiation against a visible standard. Pre-commitment is tactical as well. Attach small, reversible consequences to boundary violations early and clearly. A consequence is not a punishment. It's an operational rule that communicates cause and effect. Without consistent consequences, your boundaries are merely polite suggestions you occasionally make to yourself. The third move, calibrated silence, is often the hardest because silence triggers anxiety in everyone, including you. But silence is not passive. It's an active social signal that asks the other person to fill in the gap with content you can evaluate rather than with pressure you must react to. Silence is information. Efficient people reveal more to a quiet person because the discomfort of the pause pushes them to clarify or over-explain. Negotiators and interrogators know this. The quiet listener is often the person who extracts the truth. But silence needs posture. If you freeze and look terrified, you surrender the advantage. Practice a composed silence, steady breath, neutral expression. Relaxed shoulders, your body language tells a different story than your mind might, and that coherence is part of the leverage. When you combine these three moves, question, pre-commitment, silence, you create a rhythm that systematically deprives the manipulator of momentum. Momentum is their currency. When you break it deliberately, they must either produce a rational argument or reveal their need. Let's look at a concrete workplace scene so you can see the sequence in motion. Your manager emails at 7:00 p.m. asking for a major revision by 9:00 a.m. the next day. Their tone mixes urgency with implied disappointment. Instead of apologizing and saying yes, you reply with targeted curiosity. Which of the elements is most important to you? When the manager answers with a vague, the whole thing, you escalate your diagnostic question. If you could choose one deliverable to prioritize, which would have the most impact? Now, they must weigh trade-offs aloud. That weighing is exactly what gives you leverage. If they press immediate delivery, pre-commit, don't do next morning revisions without notice. I can prioritize X for tomorrow morning and deliver the rest by Wednesday if that helps. That sentence does three things at once. It enforces a rule, offers a solution, and prevents the conversation from colliding with emotion. Then hold the silence. After you offer the boundary and the alternative, stop typing. Let the manager feel the absence of your automatic capitulation. Often they'll either clarify their real need, maybe X was all they needed, or they'll disclaim responsibility because the urgency was performative. Either outcome reduces your burden. You will see manipulators try specific counters when this method is used. One common reaction is moral theatricality. They amplify their disappointment or frame your boundary as a personal betrayal. Expect this and prepare an empathetic but neutral line. I understand this is frustrating. My deadline policy helps me deliver consistent quality. What can we reprioritize now? Well, another common counter is triangulation. The manipulator will recruit someone else to pressure you. Counter this by insisting on directness. I appreciate the input, but let's keep decision-making between the two of us so we can move efficiently. Forcing the interaction into a single channel reduces leakage. Some manipulators escalate into gaslighting. When their old moves stop working, they'll start denying past promises or questioning your memory. In those moments, documentation is your friend. Emails, calendars, and concise text records transform narrative disputes into factual reviews. You don't need to shout facts, you simply point to them. Different kinds of controllers require different calibrations. A narcissistic controller craves validation, so refusing flattery while offering neutral recognition of their goal is effective. A guilt-based controller responds to predictability and consistency. Consistent little refusals are more effective than sporadic grand confrontations. A covert manipulator will try to bury intent under kindness. Treat those gifts as potential offers with strings. Attachment theory helps explain why people try to control and how you can respond. Someone with an anxious attachment style may use urgency and threat to ensure proximity. A dismissive style might use coldness to punish. If you can name the attachment dance, you depersonalize the tactic and design your response around predictable patterns rather than reactive indignation. You can deploy empathy strategically without surrendering your stance. That looks like, I see you're worried about this. Noted, but my capacity is limited. Here are the options I can offer. Empathy reduces the theatrical friction they rely on while you maintain the boundary that protects your resources. Power imbalances complicate everything. If the controller is your boss or a parent, simple conversational moves sometimes fail because institutional or relational leverage still favors them. In those cases, document, create allies, and consider structural fixes like redefining roles, connecting with HR, or delegating authority to someone less entwined in the conflict. Outside leverage matters too. When others expect you to be available on impulse, it often reflects a culture that rewards immediacy over sustainability. Changing that requires both individual discipline and cultural nudges, like advocating for synchronous meeting windows, norms around email response times, or team charters that reflect reasonable expectations. There's a moral economy in every relationship, and manipulators aim to control the terms of exchange so the economy always favors them. Your task is to become a principled market participant. You accept exchanges that align with your values and decline those that don't. The more principled your participation, the less bargaining space remains for coercion. One surprisingly effective move is small concessions with explicit limits. If the manipulator pushes for a favor, comply on a tiny scale while immediately formalizing the boundary around it. I can help with this 2-hour task this week, and I'm doing that under the condition we set clearer timelines going forward. That form of calibrated generosity disarms accusations that you're selfish. Consequences are not threats to the visible cost of boundary violation. If you say, I won't respond to messages after 7 p.m., but then reply at 9 p.m. because someone cries, your rule loses credibility. Consistency creates reputation, and reputation reduces future attempts at control because manipulators learn the rulebook. It helps to externalize your rules in writing. A short line in your email signature or a pinned Slack message that states your working hours and prioritization process is not bureaucratic. It's a behavioral firewall. When requests bypass the system, you return to procedure rather than personality. To build stamina for these practices, you need rehearsal that mimics real pressure. Role play with a friend who will push your boundaries in controlled ways. Gradually increase the difficulty so your nervous system learns that standing firm is survivable and often effective. Real-world courage is built in safe rehearsals. Neuroscience backs this up. Repeated practice rewires habitual reaction pathways. The more times you choose a deliberate response under stress, the more your brain scaffolds that route into default. You're not relying on willpower so much as on a conditioned pattern you built on purpose. Do not underestimate the social consequences as you become less persuadable. Some relationships will strain and sometimes collapse. That's not always a failure, it's data. The people who leave when you establish healthy boundaries were often keeping you in a state of dependency by design. Their exit reveals the relationship's true architecture. You will also encounter moral pushback from yourself, the guilty whisper that you're being unkind or inflexible. Name that whisper and examine it. Whose values are you inheriting and who benefits when you obey them? That inner probe often reveals that your guilt is a socially trained lever, not a moral compass. There are advanced stylistic moves you can layer onto the basic sequence to reduce collateral damage. One is strategic opacity. You don't need to explain every limit. Offering too much justification hands opponents ammunition. A concise reason is both respectful and suffocating to manipulative curiosity. Another advanced move is giving the other person an honorable exit. People who control often need a face-saving way to back down. Offer them a dignified retreat. If this expected timeline is critical for you, let's find someone who can provide that speed. I can support with X. This reframing preserves the relationship while removing your obligation. Triangulation is especially corrosive in families. Control by parent or sibling often involves recruiting others to validate the narrative. Counter this by insisting on direct conversations and, where appropriate, creating shared documentation of agreements so rumors cannot calcify into perceived truths. In high-stakes or abusive environments, what I'm teaching you is not a substitute for safety planning. If someone is using control violently or criminally, prioritize protection, seek help, involve authorities, and get professional guidance. These conversational strategies are for reclaiming everyday agency, not escaping immediate danger. There is a surprising truth about manipulators. They rarely want to destroy you. They want to secure predictability. When you withdraw predictability without humiliation, by being calm, clear, and consistent, you often remove the very thing they were trying to manufacture. That deflation can either heal a dynamic or expose an irreparable mismatch. If you are trying to change a long-standing pattern with a partner or family member, incrementalism wins. Large, sudden boundary reboots are hard to sustain and invite dramatic backlash. Instead, layer small, visible changes that recalibrate expectations over weeks so the social system has room to reorganize. Practice drills that replicate common scenarios, speed up learning. Run through an annoying favor request, an urgent boss demand, a late-night guilt call from a friend, and a vague family obligation. Design a short script for each and rehearse the cadence of question, pre-commitment, silence until it becomes muscle memory. The social feedback loop will adjust quickly. People notice consistent behavior and adapt. Your new habits will create new norms around you, and those norms are often more protective than any temporary act of will. The work you do to defend your attention and decisions compounds into a new social reality around you. You will make mistakes. Sometimes you will capitulate. Sometimes you'll overact. Treat those errors like data points, not moral failures. Review them with curiosity. What triggered you? Which part of the script failed? And how can you rehearse a better response? Iteration beats perfection. There's a subtle philosophical shift that undergirds all of this, and many people miss it. You are not negotiating for permission to exist. You are asking for an equitable exchange of attention and energy. Framing your interactions around reciprocal economy removes shame and places the moral burden where it belongs, on the demander. At the edge of everything here is a paradox. The more you try to control others, the more fragile your own autonomy becomes. People who manipulate are clasping at control because their alternatives feel worse. Understanding that doesn't excuse harm, but it allows you to be strategic rather than vengeful. If you take one practical ritual away from this section, make it this: before you answer any request that feels emotionally loaded, take a breath, ask one clarifying question, state your rule if applicable, offer constrained alternative, and then stop talking. That 5-step microdose is where theory becomes habit. There is still one psychological lever I haven't fully revealed in this sequence, something that shifts the entire playing field by changing how people assign value to your responses. It's not louder words or clever logic. It's a structural change in what people expect from you. In the next part, you'll learn how to apply that lever, the exact drills to make it irreversible, and the surprising ethical punchline that makes outsmarting control not just possible, but sustainable. The lever I'm talking about is expectation architecture. Intentionally shaping what people anticipate from you so their mental model stops being a tool for coercion and becomes a map that respects your limits. Your brain and everyone else's are prediction machines. You don't primarily respond to events, but to the mismatch between what you expect and what happens. Manipulators make you a moving target on purpose. If your responses are unpredictable, they can harvest surprise and guilt. When you make your patterns reliable, you convert surprise into predictability and reduce the currency manipulators trade in uncertainty. Expectation architecture is not brittle ritual. It's a pragmatic identity you broadcast with tiny signals. Instead of being someone who sometimes says yes and sometimes says no, you become someone whose responses are legible, easy to model, and therefore hard to exploit. Legibility buys you leverage because people stop gambling on you, they adapt. Start by defining a handful of high-value defaults that map to how you want to be treated. These defaults shouldn't be long sermons. They should be crisp, testable rules that you can recall under pressure because you rehearse them until they feel like truth rather than bluff. Once you have defaults, surround them with artifacts that anchor perception. People read patterns, not promises, so a few well-placed signals, an automated meeting buffer, a visible office hours time block, a short policy pinned where your team sees it, are disproportionately powerful at updating expectations. Process is your friend when willpower fails. A triage channel or a simple intake form for major requests forces a manipulator to convert an emotional ask into a procedural one. The awkwardness of filling a form is a modest cost that weeds out theatrical urgency and reveals whether the demand is real or performative. Delegation scalarizes defense. If you make someone else responsible for initial triage, an assistant, a trusted colleague, a project manager, you create a human firewall. Controllers prefer direct pipelines, adding a steward between them, and you frustrate habitual pressure because it's no longer a one-person negotiation. Automation reduces debate. Pre-written responses, calendar automations, and predictable reply templates remove the moment-by-moment bargaining that manipulators rely on. When your behavior is partly automated, it's not about being mean. It's about being consistent, which is harder to wring concessions from than a volatile ally. Attach consequences to your defaults in a way that scales rather than punishes. Consequences are not moral weapons. They're operational clarifiers. If a rule says you won't accept late requests without prior sign-off, the consequence could be a shift in priority, not a personal revenge. That keeps the system fair and defensible. Reputation compounds faster than you think. Early consistency creates an expectation that others internalize and spread. When your behavior becomes a local norm, someone on the team points to your policy during onboarding, or a friend knows your boundary, you stop dealing with individual manipulation and start changing a social algorithm. There is a simple experimental drill you can run: design one public policy for your life or work and enforce it strictly for 60 days. Track every request that triggers it, how you handled it, and the outcome. The first weeks will be noisy. By the end of 2 months, the resistance patterns and the social recalibration will give you clear data about what to refine. Language still matters, but use it to codify rather than argue. Short, neutral phrases that state a role and an outcome are ruthlessly useful. They reduce drama and redirect the other person towards solving the problem rather than demanding compliance. Think of your words as software updates for other people's mental models. There is an advanced rhetorical move you can use when someone pushes back. Ask them to write the request in one sentence and describe the measurable outcome they expect. That changes the interaction from an appeal to your emotions into a specification they must defend. Most controllers can't sustain that level of clarity. If you want to make this truly sticky, convert your defaults into a shared artifact, a working agreement with a partner, a public team charter, a pinned note, and a family group chat. Documents are not cold bureaucracy. They are the scaffolding of a predictable world. When boundaries are socialized, they survive beyond your momentary resolve. You can escalate gently by creating a visible escalation ladder, a pathway that shows where urgent matters go, who has authority, and what emergency actually means. When urgency is codified, it loses theatrical power because everyone knows the thresholds and the relevant responders. Not all manipulators are malicious architects. Many are people with unskilled ways of getting needs met. Teaching them how to ask is a generous strategic move. Show them a template for a proper request. Model a better rhythm and reward those who learn the new protocol. You're not coddling manipulation. You're training a healthier interaction pattern. There is a personal level ethics to this work. You must avoid converting your resistance into a tool for dominance. The point of creating predictability is to protect mutual sovereignty, not to hoard power. Use your new leverage to ask for fair exchanges, not to extract compliance out of weakness. You will be tested, and those tests are diagnostic. When someone repeatedly tries to bypass your systems, their behavior reveals a mismatch in goals, not necessarily a moral failing you must fix. Each test tells you whether the relationship can be recalibrated into a healthy exchange or whether the fit is broken. A practical variant of the ritual is to create a boundary ledger. Every time someone makes a high-cost request of you, briefly log it, date, ask time required, your response. Over weeks, the ledger becomes a mosaic. You can study patterns emerge. Friends who demand too much are revealed, and you gain objective grounds for later conversations. If the dynamic involves family or intimate relationships, formalize rituals that grant face, saving retreats. Offer options that preserve dignity, a time-limited favor, a one-off exception with a clear sunset clause, or a swap of responsibilities. These honorable exits let people recede without losing identity, reducing punitive escalation. In teams, you can export your boundary architecture into hiring, onboarding, and role design. New hires who expect clarity will adapt faster, and the presence of institutional norms decreases individual attempts to manipulate by making personal pressures socially anomalous. When the stakes are high and people attempt to gaslight or misreport history, your archival practices matter. Keep concise logs, save timestamps, and use shared documents that are hard to rewrite. Presentation is not about winning an argument. It's about preserving a coherent record that supports a truthful shared narrative. There is a neuroeconomic truth behind this. Your brain's reward systems favor stable prediction. When others know what you will do, social interactions become less costly for both parties. You trade the exhausting unpredictability of people pleasing for the quieter work of maintaining a reliable pattern, and your brain rewards you for the reduced uncertainty. Practice the micro skills with targeted rehearsal. Build a short script for the 3 most common manipulative moves you face, and practice them aloud until you can deliver them without heat. The goal is not to be robotic, it's to be muscle, memory calm when pressure arrives. For many people, one of the hardest hangovers is shame about enforcing standards. Counteract that with a brief internal audit at the end of each day. Note one time you upheld a boundary, one time you learned, and one small repair you can do tomorrow. This cultivates competence rather than guilt. If someone escalates to public shaming or triangulation, turn the situation procedural. Ask to move the conversation to a meeting with clear agenda items. Public performance thrives on theatricality. Procedure collapses theater into tasks to be resolved. There will be relationships you cannot renovate. When someone refuses to play the new game, their exit is clarity, not failure. The absence of coercive relationships is a kind of surplus, more time, clearer priorities, and fewer moral taxes to pay. Create rituals for your own replenishment that mirror the boundary work. Weekly reviews of your ledger, a monthly audit of how much attention you've given away, and a quarterly reset where you update your defaults in public. Regular maintenance prevents drift and keeps your social climate stable. There is a paradox worth noting. The more principled and generous your public defaults are, the less you will need to defend them. People paradoxically trust predictable fairness more than charismatic inconsistency. Your steady policies become a quiet magnet for those who respect your limits. If your context includes workplaces with institutional power imbalances, translate personal rules into team-level policies, use retrospective meetings to propose shared SLAs and agree on respect norms. When policies are collective, they do what single will cannot. They constrain systemic pressure. A subtle but powerful move is to convert emotional requests into resources exchanges. When someone asks for immediate emotional labor, complaint, reassurance, caretaking, frame it in terms of time and reciprocation. I can give X minutes now or Y hours next week, which suits the need. That turns vague moral claims into concrete traits. For people who rely on control as identity, boundary enforcement will provoke self-narratives of betrayal or panic. You can anticipate that by offering coaching or resources, suggest a counselor, propose scheduling regular check-ins, or share books that teach alternative ways to get needs met. Compassionate scaffolding reduces antagonism. The main psychological revelation I want you to keep is this: you cannot outsmart control by arguing harder. You outsmart it by changing the incentives and expectations that make manipulation possible. Change the prediction, change the behavior. Measure the impact of your new architecture quantitatively. Track hours reclaimed, number of late requests refused, nights when you weren't interrupted, and the subjective reduction in cortisol you feel. Data makes the invisible benefit visible and helps you stick to the practice when the early noise tempts you to revert. Accept that you will make mistakes. Boundaries held inconsistently teach people you are negotiable. When you fail, repair quickly and honestly apologize for inconsistency, but keep the boundary moving forward. Repairs preserve trust better than righteous flinging. There is an ethical obligation in this work. Never use these methods to manipulate others in return. Your aim is a fair economy of attention, not revenge. If you find yourself tempted to weaponize the tools, pause and return to the ledger. What is the cost you're trying to recoup, and who will benefit from that punishment? A compact training regimen. You can start today as a daily 5-minute practice. Review your ledger. Read one of your defaults aloud. Visualize one likely pushback and rehearse a calm reply. Then log one success. Small, steady inputs compound into unshakable habits. A story to make this visceral. Lena, a creative director, used to be everyone's emergency. She introduced a single visible rule: all non-crisis edits required a 48-hour turnaround unless a ticket flagged them as production incidents. She automated the ticketing, delegated first-line triage, and kept a quiet ledger. Within 3 months, the team's pace normalized, Lena slept better, and the people who truly needed urgent work learned the new process rather than puncturing her day with theatrical urgency. The ethical punchline is simple: when you change what people expect from you, you often reduce their worst impulses without humiliating them. You become a boundary leader, not a dominator, a person with dignity who models how exchange should be negotiated. Now here's a concrete first step. Pick one high-cost behavior someone asks of you that you can feasibly alter this week. Make a short rule about it, announce it where it matters, and keep a single-line ledger for every request that touches that rule. If by the end of 7 days you see even small change, you will know the principle works. If this video helped you see the architecture behind manipulation and gave you practical ways to reclaim choice, do one small thing for this channel, like the video so other people can find it, subscribe to stay on this path, and tell me in the comments what single rule you will try this week. If you want a deeper drill, watch the next video on the channel where I walk you through exact scripts for bosses, partners, and family. There's a link on the screen now.